Guten Tag.
Here I was, getting ready for the eternal nap, and this Nazi-killing jammy bastard shows up out of nowhere. What have you been up to, Blazkowicz?
With the release of not one but two new Wolfenstein games this year, this is a franchise that is seemingly going from strength to strength. If you're like me though and didn't get around to playing the first entry of the most recent reboot, you might be wondering if there's any point going back to play 2014's The New Order. I say most recent reboot because this is now technically the third or fourth time it's had a fresh start since the first game was released almost 30 years ago. 2014 was not that long ago really, but in the world of video games a lot has changed since then. Technology has come a long way and what people expect from the games they play has also evolved. The gaming landscape back then was pretty different too. There was no Fortnite, less politics, and loot boxes hadn't infiltrated every corner of the industry. 2014 was also only the second year of the PS4 and Xbox One, whereas now they're nearing the end of their life cycles. So bearing all this in mind, how well does The New Order hold up 5 years later? Is it still relevant? Is it worth your time? And should you play it before jumping into either Youngblood or Cyberpilot? In 2014, both the critical and player response to Machine Games' first attempt at a Wolfenstein game was mostly positive, receiving a few nods for Game of the Year as well as Best Shooter. Cliff Bleszinski even went as far as saying it was one of the best first-person shooter campaigns since Half-Life 2. It wasn't without its problems though. Many people thought there were elements of its design that felt clunky, and its poor technical performance across all platforms at launch was a common complaint. These issues aside though, it was a commercial hit, and it would reinvigorate a franchise that many had presumed was dead. The New Order was released at a point in time where most of the big names in the first-person shooter space were predominantly all sci-fi, futuristic, wall-running, double-jumping and laser shooting affairs. And while it does technically fall into the sci-fi category, and it also has lasers, its art direction and the story it tells was vastly different to what the competition was doing. Another big difference compared to many other FPSs at the time is that The New Order is a completely solo experience, having no co-op or multiplayer. It did get an expansion in the form of a prequel, but this was released as a standalone. Also, unlike many of its contemporaries, The New Order was a throwback to old school shooters. You can carry a ridiculous number of weapons for example. You can also dual wield most weapons, and BJ's accuracy while shooting from the hip feels like it was ripped straight out of a Schwarzenegger film. In this regard, it was kind of ahead of its time, as we've seen quite a few games return to this approach since, such as Overwatch, Call of Duty, Battlefield and of course 2016's Doom, which took the concept of blending the old school with the new and damn near perfected it. One of the most obvious questions you might have about The New Order in 2019 is how does the presentation hold up? It was described at launch as being a good-looking game, at least on the new consoles and PC. It uses the then relatively new id Tech 5 engine, which is the same platform that the first Rage and the Dishonored games were built on. It was developed during a period of transition from the 7th to the 8th generation of consoles, and as such had to cater for the aging PS3 and Xbox 360 hardware. How much this hamstrung development isn't exactly clear, but it's likely that compromises in its scope had to be made. Visually, the game is a bit of a mixed bag. While the art direction and the level design is fantastic, on close inspection the textures aren't exactly 4K, and some of the lighting effects are, well... There's also a pretty big discrepancy between character models. The main cast all look great, even up close, but some of the less important characters haven't had the same treatment. Also, just a side note, Hugh Laurie. Interestingly, it does run at 1080p and 60 frames per second on both the base PS4 and Xbox One consoles, which even in 2019 seems to be a tall order for many cross-platform titles. PC obviously was and still is the best platform from a performance point of view, but the Digital Foundry guys reckon that the PS4 and Xbox One versions actually look pretty close to a PC running at max settings. The New Order uses dynamic resolution scaling, meaning that the better the hardware you run it on, the better your chances are of a locked 1920 by 1080 resolution and 60 frames per second. It stands to reason then that there would be an advantage in playing it on either a PS4 Pro or an Xbox One X. I played through on a PS4 Pro with boost mode enabled, and I never noticed either frame rate or resolution drops, so I guess you could call this theory confirmed. Based on Digital Foundry's findings though, it seems like any gains would be marginal, so there's not going to be a big difference between the enhanced systems versus the base consoles. Performance on the PS4 Pro is rock solid. There were some concerns at launch about performance issues and bugs, but these seem to have been cleared up, at least on Sony's platform. There is a pretty sizable patch which you'll be prompted to install before you get started. It's not mandatory, but based on some digging I did, it appears to address a lot of the technical issues, so I'd recommend installing it before you settle up. The 360 and PS3 versions on the other hand hold up less well. Apparently, they keep a pretty consistent 60 frames per second, but have had their resolutions capped at 720p. They also have some really fugly looking textures and are missing a lot of detail and effects like lighting. In 2014, these might have been passable ports, but I'd definitely avoid them unless you're really gagging to play it and have no other options. Now, something that a lot of reviewers failed to highlight back at launch is the stellar soundtrack. It was created by Mick Gordon, you know, the dude responsible for the award-winning Doom soundtrack. Yeah, that guy. Wolfenstein has the same crushing industrial sound, which is used to dial up the intensity of the action. I particularly like how it kicks in when you've been spotted and all hell is about to break loose. Overall, as a package, it still presents extremely well. Every environment is exquisitely detailed, the weapons look and sound fantastic, the music is amazing, and watching Nazis explode into chunks of meat hasn't lost any of its charm. Sure, it has some scruffy looking edges here and there, but it's leagues ahead of some other games from 2014. Despite some people claiming that single-player games are dead, there have been plenty of excellent story-focused first-person games since 2014. Games like Resident Evil 7, Titanfall 2, Doom, Firewatch, and Battlefront 2. Okay, I'm only joking. They prove that storytelling in the first person is not only alive and well, but it's a genre that developers are still pushing the boundaries of. Although the New Order is practically ancient by video game standards, its story is still a blast from beginning to end. What sets it apart from loads of other games is that it's not afraid to lean into some pretty dark themes. We've had 2 big-budget World War II games since 2014, and neither of them come even remotely close to depicting the horrors of the war. There's more swastikas and Nazi propaganda in the first 10 minutes of the New Order than there is in Call of Duty World War II and Battlefield 5's campaigns combined. And while it might be predominantly fiction, it pulls no punches when it comes to tackling difficult issues. As a result, it manages to tell a sometimes confronting but far more compelling and strangely authentic feeling story. Though other aspects haven't aged as well, the story, its characters, and its atmosphere are still some of the best the medium has to offer in 2019. It's a pretty substantial campaign too, with loads of items and Easter eggs to find. It took me roughly 13 hours to complete, but it honestly felt like half that because the pacing for the most part is excellent. There is a couple of fetch quest missions which might annoy some people, but they never go on for too long and you'll be back to separating bad guys from their limbs before you know it. Outside of the presentation and the strength of the story, the other component that still stands up is the gameplay. Back in 2014, many critics felt that the need to stock up on health and ammo was at odds with the momentum-based combat, and I couldn't disagree more. Loads of other games at the time had health that would auto-replenish, meaning that you could always find cover and take a time out when things got too intense. With health and armor being a limited resource, there is no such luxury. This raises the stakes and forces you to be more strategic with your positioning. Much like Doom 2016, there's no advantage in staying put. This encourages you to push forward and seek out both enemies that drop health and ammo, as well as resources scattered throughout each environment. You can also temporarily boost your health, giving you a brief window to help deal with a difficult enemy or choke point. This adds a real risk-reward component to combat, and as a result, making it through a difficult section feels way more satisfying than it would bobbing up and down behind cover, slowly chipping away at enemies' health. Exploration is also rewarded with powerful weapon upgrades, some of which are hilariously overpowered and could easily be considered game-breaking if they weren't so much fun to use. You can also choose to stealth through many of the missions, and while this might be a smarter way to play because it prevents reinforcements being called in, it does feel like the game was meant to be played offensively. From the health system, to the way that the music kicks in when the action intensifies, to the number of weapons that chew through enemies with ease, this is a game that's begging to be played at full tilt. If I'm honest, I kind of dismissed this game at launch as just another bland military shooter. I also wasn't sure that something released so early in the PS4 and Xbox One's life cycles would be worth playing now. I couldn't have been more wrong though. Playing the New Order probably isn't required to enjoy its sequels. You'll miss out on some story elements, sure, but it's not like watching Avengers Endgame without having seen any of the previous films. That being said, I think having the full backstory always improves the experience, and if you have any reservations about whether you should go back and play this before jumping into the new games, then don't. The New Order has aged like a fine wine, and it's just as good now as when it launched. Anyway, thanks for making it to the end of the video. Remember to leave a like or dislike depending on how you felt about my ramblings, but otherwise, peace.